I broke a sacred silence that night, not with a whisper, but with the brazen, digital echo of a bell that should only exist in blasphemous history. It was through a flickering live stream, a mundane feed from St. Peter's Square, when it first tolled. A deep, resonant thrum that vibrated not just in my ears, but behind my teeth, making my molars ache with an ancient, bone-deep dread. Others in the chat laughed it off, called it a glitch, a prank. I felt it in my marrow, a resonance that plucked at the very threads of my being, tightening my chest as if something already knew the truth. The official Vatican channels were silent, of course. No mention, no explanation for the anomalous sound that had briefly pierced the Roman night. But the sound remained, looping endlessly in my mind, an insidious hum beneath my thoughts. I should have stopped when I replayed it at midnight, seeking a rational explanation, a logical flaw in the audio, but I kept listening, hoping to prove myself wrong. Instead, with each repeated toll, my certainty hardened. This was no malfunction. Why did it sound like it was calling my name? That was only the first mistake. My nights became a blur of phosphorescent screens and forgotten archives. I delved into historical anomalies, obscure papal bulls, and digitized medieval manuscripts, chasing the ghost of that sound. I sifted through references to Tintinnabulum Mortis, the bell of the dead, a mythical instrument purportedly silenced centuries ago, its existence deemed too dangerous, its purpose too blasphemous to be spoken aloud. The more I searched, the more the conventional sources grew thin, replaced by whispered histories and encrypted forums discussing forbidden esoterica. I didn't realize then that the rabbit hole I was descending was less a scholarly pursuit and more a pre-dug grave. The initial unease ripened into a gnawing paranoia as the scattered fragments of information began to coalesce. There were whispers of a Vatican conspiracy, not to hide scandalous acts, but to conceal the very mechanics of reality. A specific order, the Custode Silentiae, supposedly tasked with guarding artifacts capable of rending the veil. What was this bell, this Tintinnabulum Mortis, and who dared to stir it from its profane slumber after so long? My mind, once a fortress of logical deduction, began to fissure, cracking under the weight of what I was uncovering. The bell's phantom toll became the rhythm of my waking hours, then the discordant soundtrack to my nightmares. Sleep offered no escape. The echo pursued me into visions of shadowy figures in ancient catacombs, their chants weaving a fabric of dread. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, to coalesce into watchful eyes. I thought I was imagining it until the anonymous, garbled messages started appearing in my research threads, warning me to desist. But I kept reading, tracing lineage through shadowed pages of forbidden grimoires, until I found it, a series of glyphs, a phrase in a dialect of Latin so archaic it felt like a curse on my tongue. Vox umbrarum vocat, the voice of shadows calls. It described not just a bell, but a key, an instrument capable of resonating with the very anima mundi, the soul of the world, to awaken something that lies beyond the threshold of our understanding. This wasn't merely a sound, it was a summon, a ritual being performed with terrifying precision. I learned of names, nomina obscura, entities that could be compelled, or at least acknowledged, by specific sonic frequencies. The text spoke of a collegium obscura, a hidden order, and their attempts to re-establish connections long severed. The bell was their instrument, and its current, resonant frequency, was directed. I understood then why it had felt like it was calling my name. It wasn't personal, not truly. It was simply targeting a receiver, a mind open enough, perhaps broken enough, to perceive its true intent. Later I would understand that the bell wasn't merely ringing again. It was ringing for something, opening a door that had been sealed for an eternity. The implications were horrifying, unfathomable. The world as I knew it, the comforting illusion of order, was merely a thin membrane stretched over an abyss. And now, thanks to my insatiable curiosity, that membrane was tearing. The ringing had stopped in St. Peter's Square, but it had begun within me, a ceaseless, echoing summons. The knowledge it bestowed was a crown of thorns, pressing deeper with every fading hope of ignorance. I remember the exact moment the screen went black, not just for me, but for the entire world watching. 1 second, the impossible footage, raw, visceral, beyond explanation. The next, Just a flurry of snow and a looping, stern voice speaking in Latin. Periculum estate scientia. Danger is knowledge. That was the first warning. I should have turned off my monitor then, walked away, tried to forget the impossible images burned into my retina. But the silence that followed, the immediate cutaways from every major news network, the Vatican's swift, stony refusal to comment, it only cemented the horrific reality of what I had witnessed. Their silence was louder than any alarm bell could ever be. It screamed of things they desperately wanted buried. My research began innocently enough, a desperate search for context, for someone, anyone, else who saw it. The footage had vanished from every archive, scrubbed clean as if it had never existed, replaced by sterile disclaimers and pleas for calm. But the static, that persistent, digital snow, kept replaying in my mind. On a whim, I started recording it, slowing it down, analyzing the noise patterns. I thought I was imagining it until the interference began to coalesce, faint outlines shimmering, almost like words trying to form within the chaos. They were fragmented, ancient, unsettling. Liber, somnus, vinculum, book, sleep, bond. What kind of language was trying to communicate through dead air? The internet, once a boundless sea of information, suddenly felt like a closed circuit, every official channel a dead end. But there are other currents, deeper, darker ones, where the truly forgotten things drift. I found the forums, hushed and secretive, populated by those who also saw and refused to forget. They spoke in coded language, hinting at ancient organizations, suppressed histories, and texts locked away in vaults older than empires. They whispered of the Bibliotheca Obscura, the Vatican's hidden library, said to contain books too dangerous for human eyes. I should have stopped when the names started appearing, names not found in any public index, but whispered like curses. My nights became a blur of flickering screens and forbidden knowledge. I cross-referenced fragmented Latin phrases with archaic texts I painstakingly translated from scanned, crumbling manuscripts shared in encrypted channels. The deeper I went, the more the patterns in the static seemed to clarify, not into words, but into cryptic symbols, glyphs that pulsed with an unsettling resonance. They were sigils, I realized, not of human design, but something other. The forum spoke of their power, their ability to bind or to summon, depending on the correct intonation, the proper ritual. I didn't realize then that merely knowing them was a kind of invocation, a silent promise to the void. I started to feel a strange pull, a gravitational shift in my reality. Shadows in my peripheral vision lingered too long. The hum of my computer fans sounded like distant chanting, and the smell of ozone became a constant companion. It was during this descent that I stumbled upon a reference to the Codex Veneficus, a supposedly apocryphal text described as a compendium of forbidden names and rituals meant to open pathways between worlds. Its existence was denied by every authority, but the forums insisted it was real, a guarded secret within the Bibliotheca Obscura itself, perhaps even the source of the warnings in the static. I obsessed over the codex, believing it held the key to understanding the footage, to understanding the Vatican's desperate secrecy. I began to piece together fragments of its rumored contents, the forbidden names, the terrifying incantations, the terrible prices demanded for knowledge. It wasn't just a book. It was a weapon, a portal. Every word I read, every phrase I deciphered, felt like I was unwinding a tightly coiled spring, inch by agonizing inch. And with each revelation, I felt less like an observer and more like a participant, a player in a game I never agreed to join. The whispers grew louder, clearer. I started seeing patterns not just in the static, but everywhere. In the cracks on my ceiling, the grain of the wood floor, the way the light fractured through the window at dusk. They were echoes of the glyphs, the sigils, the very architecture of the unseen world pressing in. I felt a chill, not from the temperature, but from the dawning realization that the information wasn't just out there. It was actively seeping into my reality, reshaping it. The Periculum estate scientia was no longer just a warning. It was a statement of fact, a prophecy unfolding around me. And now, I can feel their eyes on me, the watchers I unwittingly summoned through my relentless pursuit of the truth. I shouldn't have looked. I shouldn't have dared to read. The knowledge I now possess is a cage, and the lock has just clicked shut. I thought I had been careful, meticulously obscuring the digital breadcrumbs of my illicit inquiries into forgotten liturgical practices and apocryphal texts. But then it arrived, a silent, stark white rectangle of dread sliding under the heavy oak of my study door. It wasn't slipped through the mail slot. No. It simply manifested, appearing as if conjured from the very dust motes dancing in the morning light. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, because stamped into the crimson wax, bold and inescapable, was the papal crest. My name wasn't on the envelope. No address, no stamp, just that stark, unforgiving Vatican seal. A cold dread, far deeper than mere surprise, began to bloom in my chest. I hesitated, my hand hovering, a primal instinct screaming, "Do not touch." But my academic curiosity, that persistent, dangerous siren, overruled my terror. The moment my finger grazed the hardened wax, a searing pain shot through me, an immediate, blistering burn that made me snatch my hand back, as if from an open flame. I didn't realize then that the burn on my finger was a brand, not merely a warning. Inside, the parchment was brittle, yellowed with an age that felt impossible given its pristine arrival. The script, a tight, elegant calligraphy, was undeniably Latin, yet it was wrong. A twisted dialect, unfamiliar to my seasoned paleographer's eye, riddled with archaic conjugations and esoteric terminology I couldn't place. It felt like an ancient tongue trying to reassert itself through a modern vessel, a subtle linguistic corruption that unsettled me more than any overtly demonic scrawl ever could. This wasn't just old, it was other. But I kept reading. I should have stopped when the initial phrases described not theological doctrine, but a detailed account of what I had only heard in my most shadowed dreams, the low, resonant hum of unseen celestial machinery, the names whispered by entities that had no right to names. The very architecture of the sentences seemed to thrum with a dark energy, each word a key turning in a lock I hadn't even known existed within my own mind. My skin crawled, a thousand unseen eyes suddenly feeling focused on me, peering through the very ink on the page. The letter spoke of the veiled chorus, of the echoes of the first breath, and then, chillingly, it listed names. Not names of saints or popes, but syllabic arrangements that felt less like words and more like incantations. Xylos, Malakal, Etheris Evum. I recognized them, a horrifying jolt of recognition from the deepest recesses of my subconscious, from the maddening chants that had plagued my sleep for weeks. How could the Vatican know what I'd been hearing? What unholy archives did they possess that correlated with my private torment? This wasn't merely a letter, it was an indictment. I thought I was imagining it until the air in the room grew heavy, thick with a scent like ozone and old iron. The shadows in the corners of my study seemed to deepen, coalescing into something more substantial, less like an absence of light and more like a presence. The text was not just communicating information, it was activating something. The words were not descriptive, they were formative. Each phrase a brick in a wall I was unknowingly constructing around myself, or perhaps around it. It was then that a cold dread, deeper than the first, began to paralyze me. The last paragraph wasn't a warning, it was a recognition. It spoke directly to the one who listens in the liminal spaces, the unwitting conduit. It outlined the very rituals I had only hypothesized about, the forbidden summonings whispered in hushed tones in obscure Gnostic texts, and it implied, with chilling certainty, that by simply reading these words, I had stepped into an irreversible role. I had not merely found forbidden knowledge had found me. Now, the silence in my study is no longer comforting. It's waiting. I remember the exact moment I crossed the line. It wasn't with a flourish, but with the quiet turning of a brittle, yellowed parchment I'd unearthed from the Archivum Secretum, despite clear, if unspoken, warnings. My hands, trembling slightly, traced the elegant script describing an object of profound sacrilege, a bell, campana anathema, forged from the melted relics of martyrs and infused with a purpose so unholy. The Vatican itself had expunged almost every mention of it. I scoffed then, attributing the exaggerated prose to medieval paranoia, mere superstition woven into a tapestry of conspiracy. The manuscript, an anonymous missive from a disillusioned cleric, detailed how the campana was not merely a warning bell, but a key. It spoke of its hidden chamber, deep beneath the ancient catacombs, a place where time itself seemed to curdle. The text was clear. Its toll was not meant to summon the faithful, but to awaken something else, something ancient and hungry, slumbering in the earth's dark heart. They warned me about the bell. The cleric's frantic scrawl read, but not what it summons. I found it poetic, even thrilling, convinced I was merely deciphering another forgotten myth, another fascinating piece of ecclesiastical lore. I didn't realize then that the true horror was not the bell itself, but the reverberations it would leave in my waking world. That night, the air in my study grew thick, heavy with an unseen pressure. The gaslight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced like mocking spirits. I was poring over the same section of the Codex, a particularly dense passage detailing the modus operandi of a shadowy cabal, the Fraternitas Nocturni, supposedly tasked with guarding the campana. Suddenly, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound so profound it felt less heard and more felt, deep within my bones. It was a single, distant chime, an echo that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the city. My heart seized. Impossible, I told myself. Coincidence. I should have stopped then, closed the book, turned off the light, and sought the oblivion of sleep. But I kept listening. The first chime was followed by a pregnant silence, a void that swallowed all ambient noise. Then it happened, a faint scratching, rhythmic and precise, emerging from within my walls. It wasn't the scurrying of mice. This was deliberate, answering the bell's cadence, a slow, insistent scrape, 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 that began in the far corner of my study, then seemed to multiply, echoing from every partition. My blood ran cold. I thought I was imagining it until the plaster dust began to drift, fine white powder sifting down onto my desk from an unseen fissure. The hairs on my arms stood on end. My academic detachment, my precious objectivity, began to fray at the edges. What was happening? And why did it feel so utterly personal? A second toll, deeper, more guttural than the first, shook the very foundations of my old apartment. This time, the scratching intensified, a frantic, desperate chorus, like 1,000 tiny claws tearing at stone. I gripped the ancient manuscript, its pages now feeling less like an artifact and more like a live wire, pulsing with malevolent energy. My breath hitched. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for the light switch, but my hand hesitated. Some perverse, morbid curiosity, a scholar's insatiable hunger for truth, held me captive. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster, trying to discern the exact origin, but the sounds were everywhere, shifting, enveloping me. It felt like the walls themselves were alive, breathing around me, exhaling something foul and ancient. Then came the third chime. Not merely a sound, but a force, a seismic shock that vibrated through the very marrow of my being. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, collective growl that emanated from beneath my floorboards, a sound that curdled the air. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a stench, damp earth, decay, and something indescribably metallic filled my nostrils. I saw it then, not with my eyes, but with a terror-fueled clarity. A shadow, long and impossibly thin, stretched across my ceiling, independent of the gaslight. It rippled, a fluid, unnatural movement, as if something immense was shifting just below, roused from a timeless slumber. The letter had warned of a bell, but never prepared me for the visceral terror of what answered its call. The sounds faded eventually, leaving an unnatural silence that was far more terrifying than the cacophony. The shadow receded, the cold eased, and the stench dissipated, but the plaster dust remained, a chilling testament to the night's unveiling. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, clutching the cursed codex, my mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation for the illogical. But there was none. I had rung no bell, spoken no incantation, yet something had awakened because I had merely read about it. I had prized open a forbidden door, and now I fear it cannot be closed. The knowledge I sought has become a burden, a gnawing dread that whispers in the dark, reminding me that some secrets are meant to remain buried, lest they claw their way out. And now I just listen, knowing that the real warning wasn't about the bell's toll, but about the suffocating silence that follows. I broke the cardinal rule the moment I opened that attachment, the one marked with no sender, only a hexadecimal string. I should have stopped when the first blurred image resolved into the Piazza San Pietro, eerily empty despite the bright Roman sun, but I kept clicking, kept zooming. It felt like an illicit whisper, a forbidden gaze into something deeply wrong. The whispers soon coalesced into a torrent of silent, unspeakable questions as news, or rather, anti-news, began to surface. Whispers of missing pilgrims, entire families simply gone, vanished, not reported, not mourned, just absent. The articles I scoured, the hushed online forums, spoke of personal effects left behind. Prayer beads scattered like discarded offerings, children's toys nestled against ancient cobblestones. Sonderbar-Verschwundenheit, one German site called it, a peculiar vanishing. I didn't realize then that these were merely the echoes of a much older, darker silence. Each new blurry photo that landed in my inbox, always of the bell's tower, always subtly different, was a new piece of the puzzle, forcing my eyes to see what my mind vehemently resisted. Why, in one, did I see my face, fleetingly, among the spectral crowd? My days now revolve around this obsessive pursuit, this frantic search for understanding. I sit in my study, surrounded by tomes of forgotten theology and forbidden apocrypha, the air thick with the scent of aging paper and impending doom. I thought I was imagining it when the words from the Codex Gigas seemed to rearrange themselves, forming new sentences, new warnings, specifically for me. But I kept reading, tracing glyphs that felt less like script and more like ancient scars on the page. I found the references, the oblique mentions of sacred perditio, the holy loss, a ritual of transference, of appeasement. It spoke of a hunger beneath the foundations, a slumbering entity requiring regular sustenance. The ancient Latin texts, dense and chilling, describe a terrible bargain struck millennia ago, a compact to keep a greater darkness contained, slumbering beneath the Vatican itself. They speak of the Umbra Mundi, the world shadow, held at bay only by the willing sacrifice. Not willing, not truly. It's a macabre misdirection, a cruel deception. The bell tower, the photos confirmed, served not as a beacon, but as a funnel, drawing certain souls, those deemed expendable. The irony is grotesque. Holy ground consuming its devotees to maintain an illusion of sanctity. I pace the floorboards groaning in protest, as if the very house recoils from my thoughts. Every shadow feels like a presence, every creak of the old house a conspiratorial whisper. My initial intellectual curiosity has curdled into a visceral terror. I hear the bells of St. Peter's in my dreams now, not as a comforting chime, but as a tolling knell, a countdown. The faces in those blurred photos from my inbox, the ones scattered like ghosts, they haunt me. And my own face, in that single, damning image, stares back with an unnerving, knowing emptiness. I see their fear, their brief, final confusion, the moment the light leaves their eyes. I see it because I know I am next. I should have stopped when I first saw the flicker of a name, a sigil, in the margin of a Vatican archival scan, a name that resonated with the forgotten whispers from the Codex. Malum profundum, the deep evil. But I kept reading, kept connecting the dots, until the full, horrifying picture emerged. The bells aren't just for prayer. They orchestrate the vanishings. And I can still hear them ringing. I am trapped in this knowledge, a prisoner of what I've unearthed. The ringing started subtly, a low, incessant vibration behind my eyes, long before I ever dared to decipher the cursed ciphers within the Vatican's most forbidden archives. It was a faint, metallic hum at first, easily dismissed as tinnitus, a byproduct of my ceaseless work under fluorescent lights and whispering ancient texts. I should have stopped then, when the first faint toll echoed not in my ears, but in the hollow space where my thoughts once resided undisturbed. But I kept digging, kept turning pages, convinced the knowledge I sought, the secrets of the Codex Mortis Aeterni, were worth any fleeting discomfort. I didn't realize then that the cost of such forbidden knowledge wasn't just my academic reputation, but the very fabric of my perception. Now, the ringing seeps into my sleep, a relentless, resonant chime that precedes the dreams. It's not a church bell, nor the gentle tolling of a clock, but something far older, a deep, bronze thrum that feels as though it's emanating from the deepest geological strata of the earth, or perhaps from something even further below. Each night, it drags me into the same unsettling visions, endless crypts, vast and cold, carved from a stone that seems to absorb all light and warmth. Within these catacombs, skeletons, hundreds of them, are kneeling in endless, silent prayer. Their bony fingers are interlocked, their hollow eye sockets fixed on something unseen, something just beyond the periphery of my dream sight. I've tried to wake myself, to break free from this horrifying tableau, but the dream grips me tighter with each struggle. Then come the whispers. They slither from the shadows between the kneeling figures, indistinct at first, like wind rustling through desiccated leaves. But with each passing night, they grow clearer, coalescing into a singular, insidious refrain. Answer the call. Join them. It is time. What call? What am I meant to answer? My mind screams for answers, but my dream self remains trapped, a silent observer forced to witness this unholy liturgy. I thought I was imagining it until the twitching started, small, involuntary jerks of my fingers, then my toes, then my entire body, keeping time with the rhythm of the spectral tolls. It's as if my very soul is now a metronome, counting down to some dreadful unveiling. I began to fear sleep, dreading the moment consciousness would surrender to the encroaching darkness. I tried to fight it, to stay awake, fueled by caffeine and a desperate, frantic rereading of my own research notes, searching for an antidote, a counterspell, anything that could explain this psychological assault. I pored over obscure passages, hinting at ancient pacts sealed beneath the eternal city, whispers of an elder faith that predates all dogma, kept alive through veiled rituals and suppressed texts. One fragment, barely legible, spoke of the summons of the deep sleepers, and a great chime that awakens what lies forgotten beneath the veil of ages. The words sent a cold dread through me, confirming my darkest fears. But I kept surrendering, each night falling into the abyssal hum. The boundary between my waking reality and these nightmare visions has become paper-thin, transparent. Sometimes, when the silence in my apartment is absolute, I can still hear the faint echo of that deep, resonant ringing, a phantom limb of my nocturnal torment. I see the kneeling forms, not just in my dreams, but in the periphery of my waking vision, a momentary flicker in a darkened doorway, a shadow cast too long. They are calling to me. I know it now. Their silent prayer is a conduit, a magnetic pull toward something I cannot comprehend, but which demands my presence. The whispers are constant now, even when I'm awake, a low thrum beneath my own thoughts, promising knowledge, eternal understanding, if only I would yield. I've started to recognize some of the forms in the crypt, their skeletal visages beginning to take on a strange familiarity, an intimacy that horrifies me to my core. They are waiting for me, and with each involuntary twitch, each fading moment of lucidity, I feel myself slipping closer to joining their ranks, becoming one of the silent supplicants. That was only the first mistake, delving into the forbidden texts. The second was believing I could simply walk away. I should have fought harder to stay awake, because now I can no longer tell which world is the dream. I often think about the pact I unknowingly broke, the invisible boundary I crossed the moment my fingers brushed against the brittle, yellowed pages of that old Bible. It sat on my shelf, a relic from a childhood I barely recognize, yet its weight suddenly felt different, heavier, not with the years, but with a palpable, unseen presence. I should have left it there, gathering dust, a testament to an innocence I no longer possess. But some insidious current pulled my hand, compelling me to open it, to search for a verse I couldn't name, an answer to a question I hadn't yet formulated. Tucked between the Psalms and Ecclesiastes, where I always imagined secret messages might lie, I found them. Not yellowed letters or faded photographs, but stark, meticulous drawings on thin, vellum-like paper, blueprints, intricate, detailed diagrams of a bell, colossal in scale, unlike any ecclesiastical instrument I'd ever seen. Its form was unsettlingly organic, almost skeletal, adorned with symbols that writhed and coiled, vaguely familiar, yet deeply alien. The ink was a dark, dried rust color, and when I held it closer, a faint, metallic scent, like iron and salt, clung to the paper, clinging to my fingers. What truly arrested me, however, were the notes scrawled in the margins, my own handwriting, my loops, my slants, the way I crossed my T's. But I have no memory of drawing these, of writing these specific notations. The shock sent a tremor through my body. How could something so fundamentally mine be so utterly unknown to me? Each page, every margin, bore the same phrase, etched repeatedly, almost ritually. Tu es electus ut audius. You were chosen to hear. The words burrowed into my skull, a cold, persistent hum. I should have burned it. I should have torn the pages to shreds, cleansed my hands of the metallic residue, and forgotten the entire discovery. The instinct to recoil, to protect myself from what I clearly wasn't meant to know, was powerful. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself captivated, studying the meticulous designs, poring over the dimensions, the alloys, the specific resonance chambers diagrammed within the bell's throat. My mind, usually so resistant to the esoteric, began to connect threads, pulling at academic memories of forgotten liturgies, obscure Vatican texts discussing instruments of profound, unholy power, instruments that were purged from history. The annotations began to make a dreadful kind of sense. References to resonant frequencies capable of penetrating the veil, to transdimensional harmonics, to etheric conduits. These weren't designs for a church bell to call the faithful to prayer. This was something else entirely, something to unleash. I thought I was imagining it, a phantom echo of ancient fears surfacing from my subconscious, until I stumbled upon a footnote mentioning the Canticum Immortale, a forbidden codex supposedly detailing the construction of an ultimate sonic instrument, a device for communion with entities beyond mortal comprehension. The deeper I delved, the more fragmented my sense of self became. Sleep offered no escape, only terrifying, resonant dreams where an unseen hammer struck a colossal bell, and the world dissolved into pure, agonizing sound. I started seeing things, shadows at the periphery, hearing whispers that mimicked the rustle of the vellum. The phrase tu es electus ut audius wasn't just a note. It was a mark, a brand on my consciousness. I didn't realize then that merely understanding the designs was an act of participation, a tacit agreement to the bell's horrifying purpose. I was no longer an observer. I was becoming a part of the orchestration. Now I understand. The bell wasn't just designed to make a sound. It was designed to unmake the silence, to rend the fabric of reality with a specific, calculated vibration. The names scrawled in archaic script beside certain frequency notations were not merely labels. They were invocations. The notes spoke of tuning the veil, of drawing out the dormant, of the calling of the voces. The voices. The bell was a gateway, a dreadful summons. I am trapped, tethered to this knowledge, unable to cast it off. The diagrams are burned into my mind, the metallic tang of the ink permanently on my tongue. The bell's shadow grows longer in my thoughts, its silent hum now a constant pressure behind my eyes. I made one mistake by opening the Bible, a second by not destroying what I found, and a third, unforgivable one, by trying to understand. Now, every silence feels like a held breath, waiting for the first, terrible clang. I should have stopped when the first tremor ran through the apartment. Not a physical vibration from a street below, but a shiver that seemed to originate from the very air, from the space between the words I was reading. It was then, hunched over the crumbling, leather-bound volume, the one I traced back through whispers and illicit academic channels to a forgotten annex of the Vatican's secret archives, that I first felt the true weight of what I was doing. The script, a grotesque calligraphy of Latin and something older, something prehuman, spoke of the great unraveling, of signatures of the void, and of unspoken names that shatter the divine veil. But I kept reading. The compulsion was absolute, a thirst not for knowledge, but for the dark certainty hidden within its dense, circuitous prose. I started seeing things, subtle distortions at first, the shadows in my periphery deepening, twisting into forms that weren't quite there, the faint scent of ozone and something akin to damp earth permeating the usually sterile air of my study. I thought I was imagining it, a product of sleep deprivation and academic obsession, until the flickering of my desk lamp became a rhythmic pulse, perfectly synced with the dread beating in my chest. The book promised keys, but it felt more like it was unlocking doors within me, doors I never knew existed, to rooms filled with something profoundly unwelcome. The text spoke of ancient covenants, broken not by human will, but by something far older stirring in its slumber. It detailed complex, blasphemous rituals, not to summon, but to attract, to align oneself with currents that flow through the very fabric of reality. I found a section, heavily redacted but still legible, detailing a specific process involving prolonged exposure to resonant frequencies of the forgotten dead, whatever that meant, and the repeated intonation of certain phonemes. I didn't realize then that these weren't merely theoretical constructs. They were instructions. That was only the first mistake, assuming it was all metaphor. The real horror began when the whisper started. Not just auditory hallucinations, but voices, thin and reedy, seeming to emanate from the silence between thoughts. They spoke in tongues, sometimes Latin, sometimes something that clawed at the edges of my understanding, like forgotten nightmares trying to resurface. Pater Noster, Ques and Caelus, followed by a guttural, wet sound, like something trying to sing through a broken throat. The shadows in the corners of the room started to breathe, to writhe, elongating and contracting with a life of their own. I couldn't turn away from the book, even as its pages seemed to hum with a low, almost infrasonic thrum that vibrated in my teeth. The knocking came unannounced, sharp and insistent, at an hour when only the insane or the truly desperate call. He stood there, a man in a rumpled suit and a clerical collar, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting around my apartment as if expecting to find a demon waiting by the coat rack. He introduced himself, Father Tomas, his voice trembling, before blurting out, "The Vatican," they heard, about the breaches, the old seals breaking. He spoke of ancient covenants undone, of something I was unwittingly attracting. He clutched a worn crucifix, its silver tarnished, his knuckles white. His gaze fell upon the open book on my desk, and a gasp tore from his throat. He stumbled forward, almost falling, his eyes fixed on the archaic script. His prayers, when they began, were choked, faltering mid-sentence, the Latin stuttering on his tongue. He moved towards me, his hand shaking, and touched my forehead. The instant his skin made contact, he recoiled as if burned, a strangled cry escaping him. His eyes, now wide with abject terror, stared not at me, but seemingly through me, at something he alone could perceive. He didn't offer comfort or absolution. He only whispered, his voice thin and broken, "It's already inside you," before turning and fleeing, leaving the door ajar, the chill of his fear clinging to the air. I stand here now, the book still open, its pages whispering to me, the shadows in my room no longer content to merely writhe. The silence he left behind is far more terrifying than any scream, and I find I no longer care if I ever escape what I've learned, only that I understand what is being done. The first toll was not in my ears, but in the brittle parchment itself, a faint vibration under my trembling fingers the moment I violated the final seal of the Codex Obscura, a text the Vatican had buried for centuries, deemed non-legere, not to be read. It was an actus profanus, a profane act, opening a volume meant to stay sealed in darkness, its truths forever unspoken. I should have stopped when the tremor became a hum, a low thrumming that resonated in my chest cavity, a sound no external source could produce. But I kept reading, driven by that insatiable academic hunger, convinced it was merely a psychosomatic echo of my own daring. I thought I was imagining it until the city's cacophony seemed to synchronize, the incessant rumble of the subway a deeper drone, the sirens keening in perfect, terrifying harmony with that internal resonance. It was as if the world itself was being retuned, every sound now carrying an undertone I couldn't quite isolate, yet could feel. People on the street, once a blur of indifference, now held my gaze a fraction too long, their expressions vacant, their mouths subtly working as if silently mouthing ancient, forgotten liturgies. It was then I first considered the impossible. Had I not merely read of the summoning, but become the conduit for its relentless chime? The codex spoke of voces ex inferius, voices from the deep, a forbidden nomenclature designed to unravel the fabric of perception itself, to call something across the threshold. I had dismissed them as archaic metaphor, the ravings of superstitious monks. I didn't realize then that the bell was not merely an auditory phenomenon, but a vibrational signature, a cosmic tuning fork struck by the utterance of names I had pronounced in my solitary study. Names that whispered of a reshaping, a fundamental shift in the very ground beneath our feet. I should have burned the book. I fled the city, seeking silence in the desolate stretches of the Nevada desert, then the ancient, rustling quiet of the redwood forests. It made no difference. The bell followed, not an echo but an origin, vibrating in the very earth beneath my feet, in the whisper of the wind through the pines, in the arid, breathless silence of the dunes. It wasn't outside me. It was in me, a second heartbeat, synchronizing with the pulse of the world, or perhaps, forcing the world to synchronize with its pulse. And with each reverberation, the conviction grew. The sound wasn't merely a symptom of my madness, but the manifest, undeniable proof of a conspiracy far older, far vaster, than any parchment could contain. The hollow eyes of strangers became more frequent, their silent mouthings more pronounced, their heads sometimes tilting in unison as if listening to a distant, inaudible chorus only they, and I, could perceive. I saw them in airport terminals, in crowded markets, even alone on remote hiking trails. Their gaze held a shared, unvoiced understanding, a dreadful kinship born of the shared vibration. Later I would understand that the rituals were not just about calling something, but about preparing the vessel, and perhaps the entire world, for its reception, for the Aeternapina that would descend upon us all. The question is no longer if the world will hear it, but what it will become once it finally understands the melody. The sound has permeated the very calcium of my bones, a deep resonance that aches with a terrible, sacred weight. It isn't just ringing for me anymore. It's ringing through me, a resonant frequency that alters perception, warps reality. The Vatican knew what they were hiding. They knew the danger of those nomina horrenda, those names meant to summon not entities, but conditions, a new state of being for the world itself. I kept listening, you see, because at first, it was a secret, a private terror. Now it's a global chorus, and I am merely one note within its crushing symphony. I only wish I had been deaf before I ever learned to read. I should never have translated the marginalia in the Red Codex, not when the Vatican archives had already swallowed 3 other researchers whole, their disappearances attributed to mere, stress-induced relocation. But I kept reading, drawn by a malevolent curiosity that felt less like an academic pursuit and more like a preordained fall. The script, an unsettling blend of corrupted Aramaic and archaic Latin, pulsed with a rhythm that vibrated in my fingertips, promising truths the Church had actively suppressed for millennia. That was only the first mistake. The initial whispers were faint, like the rustling of pages in an empty crypt, easily dismissed as the creaks and groans of the ancient library. I thought I was imagining it until the parchment under my touch felt unervingly warm, almost feverish, as if the knowledge trapped within was struggling to escape its bindings. It spoke of forgotten covenants, of veritas demonium, the truth of demons, and of a final resonance, a bell that would herald the undoing. What did this undoing truly mean in the context of something so utterly ancient, so profoundly forbidden? The text detailed a ritual, not of summoning, but of answering. It spoke of a name, a nomen horrendum, whispered into the void, a name that didn't call something to us, but rather called something from us. A toll, a final payment for knowledge too profound, too dangerous to possess. I didn't realize then that the knowledge I sought was a key, not to understanding, but to an unbreakable cage, forged from the very fabric of my own consciousness. Later, I would understand that curiosity was an act of self-immolation. My heart began to pound to a new rhythm, a slow, deep thrum that echoed the distant, subterranean clang I now heard, distinct from the Vatican's hourly chimes. It wasn't a clock. It was primordial, metallic, yet resonating with bone. The very air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in, heavy with an unseen presence. I tried to close the codex, to push away the ancient blasphemy, but my hands wouldn't obey. They felt compelled, almost possessed, to continue turning the brittle, blood-stained pages, revealing etchings of robed figures and instruments of strange, unholy worship. Each image seemed to breathe, the shadows within them deepening, shifting, as if observing me. The alarm started then, not the sedate, electronic bleating of modern security, but the full, guttural bellow of the Vatican's ancient mechanical warning system, designed for siege, not for psychic intrusion. Louder than air raid sirens, they shook the very foundations of the apostolic library, scattering dust motes like startled ghosts. But the sound wasn't external. It synchronized with the pulsing in my veins, with the frantic beat of that forgotten bell. The tremor wasn't just in the stone. It was in my very marrow. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, a realization that chipped away at my sanity with the precision of a master carver. The names, the chants, the whisper de profundis clamavi, they weren't just words on a page anymore. They were etched onto my very soul, vibrating with an intensity that threatened to tear me apart. I tried to scream, to warn someone, anyone, but my voice, when it came, was not my own. It was a guttural, ancient chorus, joining the crescendo of the alarms and the internal, agonizing chimes, a sound both alien and terribly familiar. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and utterly putrid, like rust mixed with ancient blood. My vision blurred at the edges, the ornate carvings on the library walls seeming to writhe, their angelic forms twisting into something monstrous, their eyes fixed on me. I should have stopped when the first tremor ran through the floor, a seismic shock that wasn't geological, but something far more intimate, far more invasive, originating from below and within. But I kept surrendering, kept absorbing the words, letting them consume me, letting the infernal rhythm take hold. Now, the final chime approaches, each toll a hammer blow against the inside of my skull, reverberating through my entire nervous system. It's not a bell outside, in some belfry or hidden chamber. It's inside me. My body has become the vessel, my consciousness the resonant chamber, my very being the instrument of its terrible, inevitable answer. The warnings I ignored, the pleas for restraint, echo now as ultimate irony. I had sought to understand the forbidden, and in doing so, I had become the forbidden, a sacrifice, unknowingly, willingly. The silence after the last toll will be the most deafening sound of all, a void where I once stood, where my mind once wrestled with forbidden knowledge. What monstrous thing, what unspeakable truth, will finally emerge from the depths when the last reverberation fades?